The hotel ballroom smelled of citrus and butter, a glossy facsimile of joy. Crystal chandeliers hung in concentric rehearsals of light, and long tables wore white linen like armor. Patricia moved through that light in a suit cut to fit the architecture of her life. Narrow shoulders softened by silk, sleeves that ended at a wrist that did not ask for sympathy. People glanced, some with the polite tilt of strangers, some with the brief calculation reserved for those who might be useful. She felt both those looks and the weight behind them, the gravity of being the one who keeps things afloat while everyone else rehearses the part of dependent heirs. Her father had a way of manufacturing small cruelties, as if they were civic duties. Gerald Smith, former bank VP, current retiree, perpetual master of ceremonies, had always wielded social settings like a boardroom. That night, he had chosen performance, a patrician smile, a glass lifted like a gavel. He stood when she reached the head table as if in signal. The room fell to the quiet of a drawn curtain. "You?" His voice carried across the room with the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. It was a voice that had once been used to give commands that felt like care. Now it was lacquered with contempt. Patricia sat a fraction away from the table's end and folded her hands in a gesture that belonged to boardrooms, not family rooms. The servers glided past, unaware they were tracing the perimeter of a small civil war. "We did not invite you," Vanessa announced, the words smoothed into a smile that did not reach her eyes. Vanessa had always been prettier, softer, more willing to perform gratitude as currency. Her husband's hand found hers across the table, possessive, like a weight. The father's laugh was thin with pleasure. "Security, escort her out." A sound like a shutter closed in Patricia's chest. Conversation around her stopped, then resumed in whispers. A woman in a pearl necklace leaned toward her companion, murmuring something about impropriety. A man she recognized from her childhood, uncle by marriage, shifted in his seat, puzzled and unwilling to supply refuge. Patricia stood. Her movement was neither defiant nor docile. It was a clean calculation. She met no one's eyes. Her mother, Louise, sat frozen at the far end of the table, fingers worrying the stem of her wineglass. She had perfected the art of silent complicity, never the one to deliver cruelty, but always present to witness it, her silence a form of endorsement. The banquet hall's light seemed suddenly too white, too revealing. They traced the fine lines at the corner of her father's mouth and the tiny triumphant crease Vanessa favored when she had prevailed.
Security approached with the practiced gait of people who moved through other people's dramas. Their faces held the neutral professionalism of those who resolve problems they didn't create. One reached for her elbow as if to steer a wayward guest. Patricia allowed her arm to be guided, to be part of the narrative she had been assigned. The difficult daughter, the entitled benefactor, the problem to be resolved with a polite hand. Outside, the city rain began in a thin, indifferent thread. She could have stayed and argued. She could have demanded apologies, evidence, a public unmasking then and there. She did none of those things. She walked to the car she kept at the curb, the same car she used to move between offices and courts and schools and the small companies that comprised a business life she'd built from a raw idea and a stubbornness that did not feel like virtue until it had to be. The back seats smelled faintly of leather and lemon oil from a diffuser she kept for long drives. Patricia sat, closed the door, and inhaled with the attention of someone who is practiced at steering her own pulse. She unlocked her phone, thumbed into apps with the same precision she reserved for spreadsheets and contracts. The banking app opened. Numbers flattened into columns. She pulled up the list of payments scheduled for the next week. The hotel's block, the caterer's retainer, the spa packages, the flights booked as part of a honeymoon she had been footing for months because words like provider and duty had been handbills she'd been given. She made the decisions quickly. Cancel the flights, void the spa weekend, revoke authorizations on corporate cards linked to the family account. Each tap was a small stroke on a ledger that had for years been invisible to the people it kept alive. She watched authorizations drop from pending to canceled. The sum crawled across the screen. Tens of thousands. Her thumb moved, the numbers fell. For an instant, she felt nothing. No triumph, no relish. Only the small, honest satisfaction of one who had finally matched action to boundaries. When she closed the app, the hotel's reservations still read under other names. The caterer's deposit had already been cleared from the ledger she controlled. She breathed out slowly. Outside, rain thickened to a steady insistence, the city washing itself in a common, indifferent blur. The cancellation emails began to populate her inbox like small, surprised creatures. Confirmations that services had been voided, polite apologies from vendors who had never known whose generosity paid their bills. Her phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. "How could you?" The punctuation had the thin victory of someone who believed the world owed them an explanation.
Patricia set the phone face down on the console. She did not reply. The refusal to reply was part of the action. The silence she kept was an instrument. She drove home the way she always did, via the bridge that arced over the river, feeling the familiar hum of the engine as if it were a steadying hand. The panic arrived in waves over the next 48 hours. Cousins and in-laws materialized at her door, their faces pitched with a new timbre. Panic, not grief. They demanded she fix it, voices muffled by the small prudence of those who had profited in diffuse ways. Vanessa arrived at the threshold with fingers twisting the hem of her dress as if the fabric could be wrung into resilience. "You can't just... People will lose flights, reservations, the condo?" Patricia listened to each plea with a patience that had the coldness of a scalpel. None of them knew the breadth of what she had been doing. None had called when she had deferred salary increases or rearranged accounts to keep the condo's utilities paid. "People will have to rearrange," she said finally, her voice even. "They'll survive." John arrived later, his consultant's voice already calibrated for negotiation. He spoke of humiliation and bills and appearances, not the years it took to build a company that could absorb $76,000 as a single week's generosity, but the immediate damage to their weekend plans and the crush of social embarrassment. She could have explained the months of hidden transfers, the coded memos, the mail rerouted to keep appearances. She could have told them how trust accounts had been rewritten on forms that smelled like someone else's legend. But the point was not to recount pain. It was to refuse its repetition. When the accountant called the next morning, his voice was a different instrument. Papered, careful. There were transactions he had not expected, annotations on trust forms that required clarity. Patricia did not answer in the way they wanted. She engaged, yes, but as a steward of evidence. She smiled when silence was required and raised her voice only to read numbers. The language of money was where she could be factual, and facts were tools in a house built on fiction.
She sat in her office the way a conductor sits before a score and began to map the simplest truth. If they wanted the performance of family, they would have to face the reality of its funding. She opened a folder, found the trust documents she'd been sent years ago, and began to trace a line through receipts and bank feeds and emails. It was the beginning of an audit that would shed light on what had been secret. For now, the ledger was private. The cancellations were a quiet answering of a public humiliation with administrative force. The banquet's laughter still lives somewhere under the chandeliers, but in the wet dawn, that laughter felt smaller than the morning's work.
The first substantive contact came that afternoon from Harold, the family accountant, whose voice had the nervous timbre of a man balancing ledgers for people who believed appearances were assets. He asked for a meeting, said some entries required clarification, transfers coded as family support, reimbursements routed through business accounts, a mortgage payment that had been left off the title search. He used words like irregular and anomaly. Those were administratively polite words for panic. At his desk, Harold spread printouts as if they were maps. He said, "This is 7 years. Recurring transfers, sometimes routed through shell accounts. The condo payments show as corporate expenses on forms I signed under the assumption they were business necessities." He looked at her as if he had stumbled into a room he had not been invited to enter. Patricia pointed to entries with a steady hand. She said, "Trace the source to the operating account. Follow the memos to the trust distributions." Harold's breath hitched when he saw the ledger lines align, payments flagged as reimbursements, wire descriptions that changed slightly over time, an off-book account that funneled sums during tax season. He had always been able to justify small eccentricities as family logistics. Now the eccentricities sketched a pattern. "We need an audit," Harold said. His voice had the weight of someone realizing he would no longer be merely an arbiter of numbers, but a witness. If there's misrepresentation here, it's not just bookkeeping. The audit moved quietly at first, then with the inevitability of legal machinery. Tiffany arrived at Patricia's office with a briefcase and a lens for clarity. She did not mince words. "We don't bring hurt into courts for catharsis. We bring evidence until the other side can't continue their fiction." Her eyes found Patricia's and held without pity. They built a list: bank statements, wire confirmations, vendor contracts, signed authorizations, the trust documents Patricia had reluctantly agreed to let Harold inspect. Patricia handed over access logs and administrative passwords as if they were tools in a chest. Tiffany cataloged each item, labeled binders, appointed clerks to subpoena hotel contracts, to extract metadata from scanned PDFs, to compel the bank's compliance office for source of funds documentation. The more they peeled, the clearer the pattern. The condo had been represented in tax papers and trust forms as owned by Patricia's parents. Mortgage statements, however, bore the signatures and the deposit history of Patricia's accounts. Contracts for the banquet listed a corporate contact that matched Patricia's company email. Invoices paid by her cards were often rebilled or cross-credited to family accounts with lazy notations like family expense. The trust distributions had been adjusted in favor of monthly allowances that matched lifestyle expenditures, condo upkeep, flight credits, spa payments. Somewhere along the ledger, generosity had been converted into entitlement. When they expanded the search, external witnesses emerged. Hotel billing managers who confirmed the cancellation emails came from the corporate account Patricia ran. The caterer who had once thanked her personally for covering a last-minute shortfall. A property manager who produced receipts showing utility payments cleared from Patricia's credit line while property tax bills bore the names of her parents. Vanessa tried to speak directly to Patricia in those days, words aimed to smooth the frayed edges. "It was all meant to be temporary," Vanessa said in a voice practiced for innocence. "You always said it was fine. We never meant—"
You accepted help without knowing what it was, Patricia replied. You asked for the performance without asking who was backstage. That's different from innocence. Under Tiffany's counsel, Patricia filed a cease and desist to stop any party from touching titles or moving assets associated with the trust fund. The motion asked the court to appoint a neutral auditor and to halt distributions pending a full accounting. It was procedural, dense with legalese, the sort of document that elbowed into private lives and demanded transparency in the public language of rules and penalties. The family countered with emotion and with lawyers of their own who specialized in delay. They offered to patch contracts, to reimburse vendors, to sign private non-disclosure agreements in exchange for silence. John phoned with a tone that mixed threat and plea, his consultant's voice calibrated for closing deals. You don't have to ruin all our lives over a party. Think of appearances. Patricia measured his words as she had measured thousands of invoices. I am not ruining anyone. I am asking for the truth. Tiffany advised restraint and a readiness for spectacle. They will try to make this a family meltdown. Let them. We litigate facts. Facts are boring to the people who traded on glamour. Facts terrify them. The audit report arrived 3 weeks later with the slow inevitability of a ledger reconciled. It highlighted 7 years of misallocated trust distributions, totaling more than $61,000 in direct misuse, a pattern of misclassifications, and clear evidence of the condo's title being misrepresented in trust documents. Metadata pulled from TDF scans suggested that certain pages had been rescanned or re-signed after the original dates. Bank compliance flagged unusual routing through a small payment processor that softened the paper trail. Patricia watched the pages as if she were reading a story she had always suspected. Each line was a line of betrayal, but betrayal with a corporate signature. She felt neither glee nor vindication, only the clarity that comes when fiction is translated into form. The numbers had weight. They could be entered into a court record. Her father's earlier command, security, escort her out, was now a prelude to a public unraveling he had never imagined would arrive in spreadsheets rather than speeches. When Harold prepared to testify, his hands trembled as he stacked the documents. He did not look at the family gallery. He looked at the judge's table, as if the judge's presence made numbers legible. He would describe wires and memos and the odd off-book accounts. He would, in the clean language courts accept, convert private complicity into public evidence. Outside her office, Vanessa launched a charm offensive, a parade of apologies and curated regret meant to slow the legal gears. She posted a carefully angled Instagram story about family challenges and privacy, a line written for public sympathy. Inside, she tried to negotiate restitution and promises. The offer smelled like bargaining chips, returns of some funds if Patricia agreed to sign a confidentiality agreement. Tiffany said no. Confidentiality protects their reputation and leaves you with nothing but silence, she said. Patricia refused private settlements. She wanted the official record. She wanted the truth, not as a quiet cash exchange, but as a paper trail stamped into public record. There was power in that permanence, power to prevent further exploitation, to prevent future claims on assets she could show as rightfully hers. She had built a company by making promises she intended to keep. She would not make a peace that required trading truth for quiet. As the case moved toward a hearing, the family tightened like a net. Threats that were more private than legal, barbed conversations meant to intimidate.
Her parents attempted to appeal to guilt. Vanessa attempted to flatter. John roared about ruin. Patricia met each with the same measured answer. We'll see what the records say. The records were patient. They did not lie about who paid what, when, and why. They did not flinch under pressure. Patricia's quiet had become a methodical preparation for daylight. She had transformed the indignity of the banquet into a sequence of administrative acts that peeled away the family's gilded fiction. The banquet's humiliation had been public. The reckoning, she believed, should be public too, and public in the exact indifferent language of ledgers and rulings. The courtroom smelled of dust and bleach, and the kind of official silence that makes whispers feel like shouts. News vans clustered outside the courthouse, and a thin line of lenses, their drivers trading updates with the ritual murmurs of people who wait for stories to be dressed for public consumption. Inside, oak panels washed the room in a sober warmth. The family sat clustered on one side of the gallery, like characters in a badly rehearsed play. Patricia sat with her attorney on the other, a quiet figure whose suit had been pressed for truth rather than spectacle. When Harold took the stand, his voice steadied as he set the binder on the rail and turned the pages with an accountant's care. He described wires, dates, amounts, and descriptors, each recited like a decimal confession. The prosecutor unspooled them into a timeline, monthly distributions that matched condo upkeep, sudden family support payments in years when the parents' declared income should have sufficed, reimbursements that mirrored personal charges on Patricia's corporate cards. Each pattern landed with factual ballast, court's favor. A projection filled the wall behind the bench, a spreadsheet with rows and columns, metadata, timestamps. For the first time in public, the ledger that had lived for years in spreadsheets and secure folders stood under fluorescent clarity. The father's face, usually florid with performative composure, drained as line after line aligned into an incontrovertible pattern. Vanessa's composure unraveled in small ways, a tremor at the corner of her mouth, a hand rubbing at a napkin until the paper softened into a smear. Tiffany stood and spoke with the sort of soft force that felt like a sharpened instrument. Quote, "We ask the court to consider not only the monetary transfers, but the representation made to third parties and the trust's beneficiaries," end quote, she said. These are not isolated acts. They are a pattern of misrepresentation that has materially benefited the defendants for years. Under cross-examination, the father tried to reshape his narrative. He described generosity, mutual family support, vague reminiscences of sacrifices made decades ago. His voice reached for a past that might absolve present actions. The prosecutor held his gaze with numbers arranged like a lattice. The father's recollection faltered when confronted with receipts bearing Patricia's corporate logo, with signature blocks that matched the electronic attestations from her company accounts. The judge asked a precise question about the chain of title for the condo. The father's answer blurred into evasions about conversations and arrangements. The turning moment came when Tiffany introduced the trust document with the rescanned pages and the altered notations. She called the metadata specialist, a soft-spoken woman in wire-rimmed glasses, who introduced herself as Dr. Lin Chen, digital forensics consultant. "I'm going to show you how documents remember," Dr. Chen said, projecting the PDF onto the courtroom screen. She highlighted a signature block dated 2019. "Now watch what happens when I examine the file's internal history." A cascading panel of timestamps appeared. The signature block had been inserted in 2021,
2 years after the document's alleged creation. The edit log showed 3 separate modifications, each corresponding to dates when Patricia had made large transfers. Gerald Smith's face drained of color. His attorney leaned in to whisper urgently. Digital documents, Dr. Chen continued in her measured tone, don't lie about their provenance. This signature was added retroactively to legitimize transactions that had already occurred. The courtroom fell silent. The mythology the family had rehearsed of parents as keepers and providers collapsed into a timeline of fabrications. Evidence does not flinch. It clarifies. Vanessa tried to stand at one point, to address the gallery with an appeal to shared history. She spoke of birthdays and childhood indiscretions as if nostalgia could create an alibi. The judge cut her short with a reminder of relevance. The public gallery, many of whom had expected gossip or spectacle, found their attention snagged by the slippery thing called proof. Outside, social feeds began to populate with commentary, condensed narratives that would later be recited in varying tones of outrage or sympathy. Inside, the case continued in the patient, granular voice of legal procedure. Witnesses were not dramatic, they were meticulous. The hotel's billing manager showed a series of emails signed by Patricia's corporate account authorizing doors and services. The caterer produced canceled checks with memo lines that matched charters of family trips. The property manager produced a ledger showing utility payments traced to Patricia's business line. When the prosecutor read out the audit summary, $61,700 plus in misused trust funds, the number hovered in the room like a weight. Notably, the audit did not reduce the family to caricature. It described a system of allowances and obfuscations that had been normalized until someone refused the role of silent benefactor. That refusal was Patricia's first precise strike. She did not seethe, she recalculated. On cross-examination, Vanessa's husband, John, attempted intimidation through volume and insinuation. He suggested ulterior motives, accused Patricia of orchestrating a public humiliation for personal branding. Patricia listened, her face an even plane. When Tiffany was asked if she wished to speak, she declined. Her presence in court was not a spectacle. It was testimony by ledger. Her refusal to dramatize translated into authority. Spectacle corrodes. Evidence accumulates. During a brief recess, Patricia had stepped outside the courtroom to find a young woman waiting on the bench, mid-20s, holding a folder with white knuckles. "I saw the case on the docket," she said quietly. "I'm here because my family did something similar. Took the money I sent home for my grandmother's care and used it for a boat. When I asked for an accounting, they said I was ungrateful." Patricia had looked at her for a long moment, then written something on the back of a business card. "Call this number next week," she said. "There might be something I can do." The woman's eyes had filled. "Thank you." That encounter stayed with Patricia through the rest of the proceedings, a small seed of purpose taking root alongside the need for public record. Patricia listened from the front row, the applause folding around her like a modest, earned warmth. She thought of the banquet hall's chandeliers, the crisp cruelty of a father's command, the sound of security badges clicking as if a life could be reduced to a single order. She thought, too, of the slow accretion of ledgers and legal filings that had dismantled that order. The two images, banquet and ledger, sat beside each other now, neither erased. The judge's voice at the end of the day carried the civility of someone about to make an exacting decision. He said, "This court will take these matters under advisement." The phrase both a closure and a prelude. The family left the room in a tangle of low-voiced counsels and hurried reassurances. Patricia walked out with Tiffany at her side, the air as bracing as a ledger balanced. Settlement talks that followed the hearing were a new theater. Lawyers for the family proposed partial restitution. Funds returned quietly, NDAs in exchange for silence, a private settlement that would preserve faces and reputations. Vanessa wept at one meeting with a practiced fragility and promised reform. John grew loud and then apologetic in the pattern of men who only sharpen their tone when they realize words can become liabilities. Patricia refused. "Truth on paper is not negotiable," she said. She wanted the public record to reflect what had transpired, not to let money alone erase the ledger. Tiffany agreed, emphasizing that confidentiality would allow the same misrepresentations to recur in private arrangements. The choice was a moral one as much as a legal tactic. Public censure for private deception, a refusal to allow the family to retain both wealth and reputation without accountability. When the judge's written order arrived a month later, it read with the calm authority of law: restitution payable within a set period, reassignment of title for the condo to Patricia's name, and a prohibition on the parents' access to trust distributions pending oversight. The language was precise, the sanctions concrete. No dramatic fanfare accompanied the delivery, just the slow unspooling of legal consequence. The family's glare turned private then. The father, who had once stood like an emblem of control in ballrooms and on social media, found his access to a phantom pedestal curtailed. Vanessa attempted reconciliation, small notes and tentative invitations, but Patricia had recalibrated what family meant. Distance had become a boundary spoken in legal terms. Patricia sold the condo 3 months after the judgment. The proceeds, $340,000 after legal fees, went directly into an account she'd already established, the Esmerelda Smith Foundation, named for her maternal grandmother, who'd worked as a bookkeeper and once told her, "Keep your own ledger, Patricia. Don't let anyone else hold the pen." The foundation's mission was pragmatic: grants for women financially severed from families who'd treated them as unpaid institutions. The young women from the courthouse became the first recipient: $5,000 for legal fees to pursue restitution from relatives who'd misappropriated her grandmother's estate. At the small inaugural gathering in a community center, Patricia kept her remarks brief. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about creating recourse when family becomes a financial trap. It's about making invisible labor visible." She thought of the ledgers, the courtroom, the metadata timestamps. "Truth on paper," she added, "can become a foundation." There was no chorus of redemption in the family's absence. They flitted at the periphery, an Instagram story here, a constrained holiday card there, but they no longer had the license to call themselves providers. The public record had corrected the narrative. In private, Patricia kept the ledger she had always kept: contracts, statements, separate accounts for company and family, now guarded with legal clarity. The banquet's humiliation had been the smallest of wounds in hindsight, because the deeper damage had been the erasure of authorship, her labor rendered invisible. The court's ruling and the foundation's work were not balm in a sentimental sense. They were mechanisms of reclamation. She had not sought to punish out of spite. She had sought to rearrange the architecture that allowed invisibility to thrive. On the anniversary of the banquet, she stood before a small group of grant recipients and watched as a young woman who had once slept in an on-campus car park signed an application with hands that shook less than before. Patricia felt, for a moment, the raw, exact satisfaction of repair. Justice had been measured, not theatrical. The ledger had been balanced, and in the balance, a different kind of inheritance was begun. The foundation's first year brought 15 recipients, and a clarity Patricia hadn't expected. The work was administrative. Grant applications, compliance forms, legal referrals, but it transformed private injury into public structure. When a recipient sent a photo of herself graduating from a vocational program, Patricia kept it on her office wall, beside the spreadsheet from that first night in her car, the one where she'd canceled $76,000 in obligations. The two documents belonged together. The ledger that ended one story, the grant that began another. She found that the tidy work of forms and bylaws was a salve for the part of her that had once absorbed other people's crises because she couldn't name a limit. Drafting a mission statement was not catharsis. It was instruction. The foundation would provide seed grants, legal referrals, and microloans to women who'd been financially cut out by family dynamics. It would teach budgeting, link recipients to vocational resources, and fund short-term housing while legal claims were pursued. The rules were set with the same exactitude she demanded of her company. No ambiguity in eligibility, no back channels for reputation laundering. On the first day applications opened, she read each submission herself. She would later delegate, but for the beginning, she wanted to see the names, the handwriting, the proofs of eviction notices and final pay slips. The stories arrived as if from someone else's life. A mother who left an abusive household with only a gym bag. A student whose scholarship had been revoked when relatives demanded collateral. A nurse who had been expected to underwrite 3 generations of relatives' dental care from her hourly wages. Each packet was a small, bright emergency. She answered the first thank you email with the blunt kindness she reserved for contractors. Precise next steps, contact numbers, a timeline. She could have written them long letters about betrayal and reclamation. Instead, she offered timetables and resources. That was the work of repair. At home, absence expanded into a new architecture. The family's attempts at rapprochement dwindled into rote messages on birthdays, contacts that circled like birds, uncertain whether to land. Her parents sent a check once, anonymously wired through an intermediary in a way that suggested more performative guilt than restitution. Patricia returned the amount with paperwork attached, an explanation that any future transfers would need to be routed through legal counsel and reflected in the trust's audited accounts. The statement came as a small cognitive shock to them. The language of legal boundaries was harsher to those accustomed to pliant reciprocity than any flourish of anger would have been. Her sister sent curated images of family meals, attempts to manufacture intimacy as if it could be photographed into being. Vanessa left a voicemail at one point. Short, fragile, then shoring into accusation. "You humiliated us." Patricia listened, the message playing through again, then deleted. She did not call back. She found it easier to maintain a boundary than to digest attempts at guilt used as currency. The clarity of ledger and law felt less like coldness and more like a necessary translation of what people had refused to see. Business moved on in the way resilient things do. Her company continued to supply clients across 5 states. Employees reported to meetings, sent monthly reports, and gathered for quarterly reviews. A mid-level manager broke down in a hallway about the family drama. An employee asked whether the stress had affected upcoming bonuses. Patricia handled each administrative concern with the same method: documentation, timelines, and human consideration. Leading a company had taught her how to compartmentalize without losing sight of consequences. The foundation's work became a visible, steady chair in the architecture of her life. Purpose, not as revenge, but as practice. There were moments of private reckoning. Nights when silence in her apartment felt like a third presence, the absence of their old voices a hollow room. She would sometimes pull the ledger she kept for the Smith Foundation and run numbers, as if the arithmetic could stitch an inner seam. On those evenings, she allowed herself a small indulgence. Music low, a glass of wine poured without ceremony. She reflected on the oddity of being both generous and guarded.
the strange intimacy of a person who had to teach family accountability as if it were a professional ethic. She understood, finally, that her refusal to be invisible was not merely about money, it was about authorship. Who got to name the story, and who was allowed to be a character in someone else's narrative. The media cycle curled around the case for a season. Podcasts dissected the ethics of familial obligation. Op-eds argued about legal recourse versus private forgiveness. And a few local panels invited her to speak. She declined most invitations. When she did appear, she spoke plainly about financial boundaries, legal recourse, the difference between obligation and exploitation. Her public tone was less furious than her pedagogy. People wanted sound bites. She offered checklists, maintain separate ledgers, document transfers, set explicit repayment terms, and, when necessary, formalize family support through lawyers and trustees. Viewers who had suffered similar erasures sent messages that were small miracles, thanks small and raw as a hand placed against a window. The family's social unspooling had consequences that surprised them. Those who had enjoyed the badge of being providers now found gatekeepers at institutions where they once had padlocks. Their names no longer carried the soft leverage of assumed benevolence. Friendships, constructed on the currency of hospitality and joint appearances, thinned as gossip turned to inquiry, and inquiry turned to social distance. The parents found invitations drying up. Vanessa's husband discovered that certain clubs she once navigated were less tolerant of legal complications than of charm. Money did not erase shame quickly. It never does. But the public record had a stubborn quality. It lived in filings and judgments that could be pulled and read. Truth on paper meant that when new business partners or romantic prospects searched their names, they encountered facts that complicated the curated narrative. The family's reputation, once a warm blanket, now caused others to hesitate. Months folded into a year. The Smith Foundation dispersed its first set of grants. A small ceremony in a community center brought together recipients, local nonprofit leaders, and a handful of donors who believed the model could scale. A young recipient, an apprentice mechanic who had been cut off from her family when she refused to provide the family with a car for resale, held the mic with hands that trembled, but a voice that steadied as she spoke. She thanked the foundation for the literal shelter it provided while she secured training, and for the sense that someone had finally read her paper trail and believed her. She kept the distance she had crafted with hard edges and clear language. She did not romanticize reconciliation. She left space for human error, but not for exploitation. When family members attempted to reinsert themselves into her life on terms that resembled old scripts, she redirected them to the foundation's intake process. If they needed assistance or mediation, they could apply and be judged by criteria she and her board had set. It was a small mercy and a firm boundary. The foundation's second year brought modest growth and a clearer voice. Local funders matched seed grants. A pro bono lawyer offered workshops. Patricia began to travel occasionally for speaking engagements on financial self-protection and nonprofit governance. She accepted payment for some appearances and donated it straight back to the foundation. Her public persona settled into something neither vengeful nor victimized, a professional who had reclaimed authorship and now invited others to do the same. 2 years after the judgment, Patricia drove past the old condo on her way to a foundation site visit. Its windows reflected an indifferent sun. She felt only a faint tug of memory. The building no longer contained the story of her service. The keys had been sold, the ledger had been balanced, the public record had spoken. She had not become softer, she had become exact. The banquet's humiliation remained a corner of memory, sharp but contained. But the rest of her days were made of grant reviews, legal consultations, and occasional messages from recipients whose lives had shifted because someone had finally documented their truth.